Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Fascinate session called Make a Microbe. This one is specifically for guides and rangers, but if you're a rainbow or a brownie, that's absolutely fine. You're more than welcome to join us. I've already done one session for the rainbows and brownies, so this is going to be maybe a little bit more scientific, a little bit more heavy on the detail, but you are absolutely welcome to join us. So today we're going to talk about microbes. So everyone knows that there are microorganisms that are bad for us, that make us feel ill. I think the virus that causes COVID-19, which is called SARS-CoV-2, it's a really good example of how a microorganism can cause a lot of problems. But specifically today, we're going to focus on microorganisms that are good for us. But let's do a quick kind of compare and contrast first. So what's the difference between a good microorganism and a bad microorganism? And what are some examples of those? So on the left side here, we've got some harmful microorganisms. So the top two are different kinds of bacteria. So there can be salmonella on raw chicken or E. coli on raw meat. Often beef, and these microorganisms will make us feel really, really ill if we eat them. So salmonella and E. coli can give you really, really bad digestive problems and can be really dangerous if it's untreated. The next two there, ringworm and athlete's foot, these are different kinds of fungi that can get into your skin. You can also get a fungal infection in your nails, and those can be really difficult to treat because of the three types of microorganisms that we're going to be talking about today. So viruses, bacteria, and fungi. Fungi are the ones that are closest to human cells. So remember, fungi are what we call eukaryotes. So they have a nucleus and they have biochemistry that's very similar to human biochemistry. So it's really difficult to make a drug that can have a negative effect on fungus without having a lot of side effects on human cells. So they can be really tricky as different diseases. Other microorganisms, so algae or microscopic plant cells, these particular ones, these red algae, they can proliferate like crazy in the water if it's warm, shallow water. And these algae actually produce toxins that if they get into our food or our water and we consume them, they can cause a lot of problems as well. And then obviously there are different infections that can cause problems in different parts of your body. Your respiratory tract is a really, really important target for a lot of these harmful microorganisms, just because we're breathing all the time and we're always exposed to what's in the environment. So the example that's there is strep bacteria. So that's a type of streptococcus, and it can infect the back of your throat, and it can give you a really, really sore throat for a couple of weeks. It's surprising how long it takes to go away if you have strep throat. I've had it once and it was not very nice at all. But on the other side of things, there are beneficial microorganisms. So hopefully everyone's heard of the antibiotic penicillin, and a lot of the other antibiotics that end in -cillin have similar structures. The original penicillin is made from a fungus. So the story is that in London, where Alexander Fleming had his lab, there was a fungus lab in the on the floor above him, and he had left the windows open in his lab over the weekend. And some of the fungus from the lab upstairs blew into his bacterial cultures. He was trying to grow bacteria, and he found that wherever the fungus landed, the bacteria died. And that's how we ended up with penicillin. So we've really only had penicillin for less than 100 years as a common drug. So it's really important that we carefully use our antibiotics, and we only use antibiotics when they're absolutely necessary. So when we really do need to kill off a bacterial infection, when our own immune systems haven't been able to take care of it. And it's also really important that we don't use antibiotics for things like viral infections. So getting an antibiotic for a common cold is not a very good thing, because if you have any other bacteria hanging around in your body, you could actually make them resistant to penicillin. And antimicrobial resistance is a really big problem we need to deal with right now, because we're getting a lot of bacteria that are becoming resistant to antibiotics, and we do not want to go back to a time before antibiotics were useful. That would not be very good. Other beneficial microorganisms, so there's a lot of microorganisms that are in our food. So if you think about blue cheese, that's often a fungus that grows in the cheese and gives it all sorts of different flavors and textures and colors. I personally love blue cheese, and I'm happy to eat that particular fungus. You can get bacteria that turns milk into yogurt. So any kind of food that is fermented. So if you've heard that term fermentation before, that involves a bacteria that is deliberately put into the food and that causes a microbiological or biochemical change in the food that gives it different properties and different textures and flavors. So yogurt's a really good one. If anyone's eaten kimchi, which is fermented cabbage, it's a very popular food in Korea. That's another fermented food. And these foods can actually be really, really good for you. Those bacteria that are used to ferment the foods actually have a lot of beneficial effects in our own guts as well. Other types of microorganisms that are used for food. So yeast for making bread is a really popular one. Yeast is also made to ferment alcohol. When you get to be old enough to drink alcohol, then you can think about the yeast that went into that process as well. And then there, as I mentioned before, there are bacteria that naturally live in our intestines that do a lot of really good things for us. They help us to digest different kinds of food, particularly plant matter, because plants can be quite hard to digest, but those bacteria help us with that. And those good bacteria also help control the levels of any bad bacteria that might make their way into our intestines by competing for food and just making the environment really hostile to harmful pathogenic bacteria. So just to get into this fermentation and yeast situation a little bit more. So if we think about yeast, it's, as I said, it's a fungus. So it is very similar, much more similar to a human cell than say bacteria is. So bacteria, for example, they don't have a cell nucleus. Their DNA just floats in the cytoplasm. They have a cell wall as well as a membrane, depending on the type of bacteria, whereas human cells only have a membrane and no cell wall. So they're actually quite different. And that's why we have so many different kinds of antibiotics, because we can attack bacteria in a number of different ways that don't harm our own cells. Whereas fungus, it's a little bit harder to do. But if we think about yeast as one really good example, yeast is added to bread flour as the bread is being made. So you would mix flour and water together and any other ingredients you might want to put in there. And then you would add yeast. And the yeast comes, it can either be in a live culture. If anyone has made sourdough bread before, you'll know that there's a sourdough starter that usually sits in a jar in your refrigerator somewhere, usually in the back corner of the refrigerator. And in that starter is a mix of yeast and bacteria that will help make the bread nice and fluffy. So what happens during that fermentation is that the yeast eats the sugar from the bread dough. And that sugar is coming from the complex starches that are in the flour. And the yeast can break down the starch into simple sugars and use that sugar as food and allow that sugar fuel to help those yeast proliferate. So they make copies of themselves and they have daughter yeast. The other thing that happens with that is that gas is produced. So the yeast will make carbon dioxide as a side product, and that carbon dioxide, the gas ends up in the bread dough as the bread is cooking, and that is what makes the holes in your bread, the carbon dioxide from the yeast. So please, next time you're eating a piece of bread, take a look at that bread and thank the yeast for making that bread nice and fluffy and putting all those little holes in there. And again, on this slide are a bunch of different foods that are made from different or made using different microorganisms. So there's yeast, a fungus in the bread, there's bacteria in cheese, there's yeast used in making alcohol, and another kind of yeast that is used to make Marmite. There's bacteria like lactobacillus in yogurt. Those are really good bacteria for us. Again, there's yeast used to make beer. And corn, finally, is a type of fungus that's grown on a large industrial scale and makes a product that kind of has the same texture as meat, depending on how it's processed. So if you're trying to have less meat in your diet, corn's a really good substitute for that because you can add all sorts of different flavors to it, and it's really environmentally sustainable to eat corn. All right, and finally, how can viruses help us? So everyone's obviously aware of the COVID-19 pandemic caused by a new virus that hardly anyone had any kind of protection to at all. So it originated in China and then really, really quickly spread all over the world. So how do we basically protect ourselves from this virus? So one way, unfortunately, is to get the virus And then your body develops a resistance to that virus. Your immune system figures out what that virus looks like and produces things like antibodies. So those are the molecules that are shown in red there. And those antibodies can help coat the outside of the virus and keep the virus from infecting your cells. Alternatively, your immune system can turn on a very special kind of immune cell called a cytotoxic or a killer T cell. And these T cells, once they've been shown what the virus looks like, their job is to patrol your tissues and look for any cells that might have been infected by that virus. It can recognize a virus-infected cell by different markers on the cell surface, and it goes and it kills that cell and it destroys everything inside, including the virus. So it's a really efficient way of getting rid of that virus. So we can use vaccines to protect us from different viral infections, as well as different bacterial infections. And there's also vaccine work going on to help protect us from other kinds of infections that are made by parasites like malaria. So it'd be really good to have a vaccine against malaria. That would really help a lot of people in the world. Now, how these vaccines are made are quite different. So the old version of vaccines that started being used like maybe 200 years ago, those would be a dead virus. So either someone collected a virus and then basically cooked it. So that virus can't infect you anymore, but it still has all of its outside bits and your immune system can recognize that. Newer viruses, like the ones that have been made against SARS-CoV-2, don't use the whole virus. They just use a tiny little piece of the virus, something that's very important that's expressed on the outside of the virus that your immune system can use to recognize it really quickly. So I had the AstraZeneca virus back in the spring, or the AstraZeneca vaccine back in the spring, and that vaccine is made from a virus. But there are other newer types of vaccines that have no virus in them at all. It's just a little sort of globule of fat that has the material inside it for your own cells to make a little tiny piece of that virus just so your immune system can recognize it. So vaccine biology, really, really fascinating area of biology. And if you have any questions on vaccines, please put them into the YouTube chat and I will try to answer them throughout the day. Okay, so this particular activity, what we're going to do, hopefully everyone has, I can't find my template, there it is. Hopefully everyone has printed off the activity sheet with different ideas of how we can make beneficial microbes. So I've got a virus, a bacteria, and a yeast on here, and just some different ideas of what their superpowers can be. So viruses are the smallest, on average about 100 nanometers. So a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. These are tiny, tiny little things, about 1,000th the size of our own cells, roughly. There can be different, a range of virus sizes. But different superpowers that they have, a really important one for different viruses is infection control. So you can actually have viruses that specifically seek out and destroy different types of bacteria. So you can actually use, instead of like a drug compound kind of antibiotic, you could use a virus as an antibiotic. And actually in Russia for a really, really long time, they use viruses instead of antibiotics. And apparently in some shops, you can still get them. So there you go. The next one down there I have is the bacterium. So bacteria can be used for all sorts of different things. They're very popular to be used as chemical factories. So you can program a bacteria to make a huge range of different products, depending on what you want it to make. So we'll talk about a couple examples in a minute. They're also good at moving to different locations. So you can give bacteria different tools that allow them to move to specific sites in the body, for example. And they're really good at sensing what's going on in the environment around them as well. So I put a little sensor icon on there, because bacteria are really good at seeing what's going on and what kind of resources are available in the environment, and then they can respond to those resources. And then finally, we've got yeast. So yeast is the biggest one. Yeast cells about the size of a human cell, so about 10 microns. So a micron is 1/1000th of a meter. And remember, these are the cells that are most like our own cells. And see how it's got little, almost like feather-like structures coming out of the side of it? I think that's really cool. That's actually what a lot of yeast look like under the microscope. So sometimes when I'm culturing cells as part of my job running a research lab, sometimes if we're not really careful, we can get a yeast infection in our cells, and then we have to throw them in the bin. But yeah, it kind of looks like that with those little thread-like structures coming out of it. Yeast are really, really cool because they can process a lot of larger compounds and chop them up into smaller pieces and then use those pieces to make something really useful for us. So I've made a couple examples of cool microbes that I think would be really, really nice to have in our arsenal of different microorganisms that we can use to make things that are beneficial to us. So the first one I made, hopefully you can see that there, is a Malaria Hunter. So I have used a virus. So this looks like a phage kind of virus. This is a special kind of virus that specializes in infecting other microorganisms. So I want to develop a phage virus that specifically finds and recognizes the malaria parasite, which I've drawn there. Hopefully you can see that. It's a little purple parasite inside a red blood cell. And this is one of the really tricky things about malaria, because this little parasite that you get delivered into your body by being bitten by a special kind of mosquito that lives in the tropics, this little microorganism circulates through your body and eventually it moves into your red blood cells, which means your immune system can't find it. So it's hiding inside one of your own cells. Which makes it really, really difficult to get rid of. And it makes it a little difficult for drugs to get into those cells as well. So treating malaria is a tricky business. And I would like to come up with a phage virus that can get rid of malaria. So the specific phage virus can get into red blood cells that are infected with malaria so it can find them. And then it uses its hammer function to destroy that pathogen. And it also has memory capacity. So it can remember what a malaria-infected red blood cell looks like. So if you have this virus in your system, it can kill malaria parasites that are in your blood and hopefully make you feel better, because malaria makes you feel really, really rubbish. You get a fever, you get shivers, you just really, really feel awful. It's not very nice. And sometimes it can come back as well. Phage idea was from my friend Patricia Perez Esteban at Aston University. So we had a nice chat about this, and she is an expert in phage viruses, and we talked about that particular idea. This next one here, the sugar sensor, this is an idea from my friend Jonathan Cox, who also works at Aston University with me. And he studies bacteria, mostly tuberculosis bacteria, but he knows a lot about all the other bacteria as well. And what he thought would be a good idea is if we had a bacteria that lived in our guts that specifically measured, using this sensor here, how much sugar is in our blood. Now, for most people, we're able to control the amount of sugar we have in our blood. We have a pancreas that can respond to sugar. And if you need to get sugar out of your blood, you would add insulin. So people with diabetes, they don't produce insulin correctly. So their blood sugar can get very, very high, and that can actually damage some of the cells in the body. But usually a lot of blood vessels, they do not like very high sugar, and it can cause a lot of problems. So the idea with this bacteria is that it lives in your guts and it senses the level of sugar in the body. And when the sugar level gets too high, it produces insulin. And that helps all of the other cells in the body get the sugar out of the blood and into the cells where it can be used to make energy. And then you avoid that problem of having a really high blood sugar, which can be very damaging. So this is just a different way of treating someone with diabetes that doesn't require a needle injection of insulin. So I think that would be really cool. Just have this bacteria always ready to go, monitoring how much sugar is in the blood and ready to produce insulin when we need it in people who don't have a properly functioning pancreas. And finally, the third example I have here is a yeast, and I've called this yeast a plastic muncher. So I've colored that yeast yellow because it's nice and bright and brilliant. This is the kind of yeast we need to have able to get rid of plastic waste. Because as you know, we have a really tough time recycling plastic. A lot of the UK's plastic gets sent overseas for recycling. And I wonder sometimes if it really does get recycled or if it just manages to get into a landfill, or even worse, if it's burned, because that would be really bad for the environment. So what I want to do with this yeast is give it special enzymes to cut up those large plastic molecules and make them into something more useful, building blocks that we can use for other chemicals. So it might be something like making a type of biofuel, or it might be making chemicals that can be used in the pharmaceutical industry to make medicines that help treat different diseases. So those are the three ideas I came up with for these different microorganisms. So hopefully you've got the activity sheet and you can make your own microorganisms. In the last couple of minutes we have, I'm going to make one more. I think I'm going to make a yeast that specifically makes biofuel. So I'm going to color this yeast in. So biofuel is really, really important. I think we've got a couple sessions with Fascinate on renewable energies. So if you're interested in renewable energies, you should definitely check out those sessions with Fascinate. But the reason why biofuels are really important is because we don't want to be burning fossil fuels anymore. So fossil fuels are based on carbon that was in the atmosphere millions and millions of years ago. It's actually carbon that is older than the dinosaurs. So it's usually made from plants from the Carboniferous era that have been in the ground for a long time, that have been squashed and heated and moved around and transformed into fossil fuels like coal and petrol, like petroleum and natural gas. And we have been using those fossil fuels for a couple hundred years now to heat our homes and to fuel our vehicles and to basically make the economy work and to get things done. Now, we know now that this is not having a very good effect on the planet. It's releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that carbon dioxide can trap heat from the sun and obviously cause a lot of problems by increasing the temperature of the planet as a whole. And this has been causing a lot of really not very good things to happen in the environment in terms of like ice sheets melting in Greenland and Antarctica, and sea levels rising, and there are going to be more severe storms and that sort of thing. So we really do want to get a handle on global climate change before things get really bad. And I think biofuels are a way to go. So what I have done with this particular yeast, got that one there, I've got a yeast that is good at digesting agricultural waste. So where I grew up in Canada, I grew up in the province of Ontario in a city called Windsor. And around Windsor, it's a lot of farmland. And the most common crop that's grown around where I grew up is corn. So everyone hopefully has seen what sweet corn looks like when it's growing. It's a very, very tall plant. But we only eat the corn in the ears at the top of the plant. And what's not what we consider fit for human consumption usually goes to feeding agricultural animals like pigs. So we use the fruit part of the corn, so those yellow ears of corn, we use that pretty effectively. But the rest of the plant essentially gets wasted. It either gets plowed back into the ground as fertilizer, or it may get burned or composted. But it's a part of the plant that we don't really use for anything. So what I want to do with this yeast is to have a special kind of yeast that specifically eats the leftovers of corn production. So it's called stover. So this is a corn stover consuming yeast. It's got special enzymes that can break down that really tough plant material. So if you think about how tall that corn is, the stalk of the corn needs to be really, really tough. So it's got a lot of compounds like lignins in there, and they can be very hard to digest. So this is going to be a super powered yeast that can digest all of those lignins and hemicelluloses and all of those really tough proteins that are in plants. And that yeast is then going to break down that plant material and specifically turn that into biofuel. So it's going to turn it into ethanol, and that ethanol is something you can pump into your vehicle at a station, and you use it instead of petrol. So it's really good for the environment because that corn has taken carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere very recently. So it might be last year's carbon. And by burning that ethanol, you're really just putting it back into the atmosphere in a very short term. So instead of using fossil fuels, which is taking carbon from millions and millions of years ago and putting it into the environment, this is using more recent carbon and is much better for the environment. And it actually solves an agricultural waste problem as well by finding an alternative use for bits of the plant that we're not using for food. So hopefully you found this to be an educational session. I've put some ideas up on the screen if you want to look at different shapes of different microorganisms and get some ideas and be creative about what you want your microorganisms to do. And if you want to share what your microorganisms look like with an adult's help, you can put pictures of your microorganisms on the Midlands Facebook page, the Guiding Midlands Facebook page, and I would really love to see what ideas you come up with and how you think we can use microorganisms to solve our problems. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Don't forget to put any questions or comments into the YouTube chat, and I will try to answer those as soon as I can. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed the session. It was great having you, and enjoy